And welcome to the September 28th meeting of the Finance Committee. For those watching at home, certainly with the current COVID situation in the province and our own internal protocols, that's why when we were meeting in person, we were all wearing masks all the time. So please, I would ask staff and committee members, just when you are speaking, make sure you do your best to speak clearly into your microphone so that we're able to be heard. And with that, I'll call the meeting to order. And ask for a motion on the agenda. Any thoughts of moving 4.3 up?
Oh, Chair, I'd move to. Chair, I'd move to move 4.3 to the top of the agenda.
Thanks. Okay, Councillor Hickey and Your Worship, all in favor, aye?
Aye.
Contrary minded, carried. Item number 2 is approval of the minutes from July 22nd. Councillor Hickey, Councillor Redwin on the motion. All in favor, aye. Contrary minded, carried. The consent agenda. Somebody would like to make a motion on 3.1? Your Worship and Councillor Redwin, any questions on the motion? All in favor, aye. Aye. Contrary minded, carried. 4.3, the Growth Committee Strategic Land Reserve. Pass it over to our CFO.
Good evening. Thank you, Chairman Sullivan. I'll just tee this up really quickly. As part of the consolidation of the city's economic development agencies into Envision St. John, the assets developed St. John were returned to the city as part of the wind-up exercise. Common Council transferred approximately a little bit over $1.6 million in net financial assets from Develop St. John back to the city through that process, and it was placed in a new strategic real estate capital reserve fund. Council then directed staff to return with a policy on when and how the specific fund may be accessed and what criteria would apply and what it may or may not be used for. Before you this evening is Mr. David Doppelstein, our growth manager, who's going to present the draft policy with respect to this. It has been endorsed by the Growth Committee, and it's here today being referred from the Growth Committee to the Finance Committee for endorsement. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Mr. Doppelstein.
Thank you, Mr. Fudge. Good evening, Finance Committee. This is a first, I believe. I believe this is the first time we've had a referral from one standing committee of council to another. And I'm here on behalf of Growth Committee and also here to express the regrets of our chair, Councillor Killen, who was unfortunately unable to make it this evening, but our CFO provided a good introduction. And just for your knowledge, this draft policy was approved by the Growth Committee in principle and has now been referred to this table with the recommendation then to proceed to council. So as CFO alluded to, and as some of you who were on council last term would remember, with the wind down of Develop St. John, which wound down on December 31, 2020, the net financial assets returned to the city. And so we went to council in the spring with a recommendation that those assets be placed in a reserve fund to support the city's initiatives, particularly related to strategic real estate. And at the time, council directed staff to come back with a policy on how to access this fund. And so before you tonight is that draft policy. This policy would require a substantiated business case for any items to proceed. And in practice, what we mean by this is if either the city itself, the various departments, or one of our economic development agencies comes forward with an idea and decides this is worthy of support and this will be catalytic to the city's purposes in driving further growth, it would go before Growth Committee with a presentation. Now, this presentation will be reviewed by staff prior, by various departments, just to ensure the business case is sound and there's a sound financial return on investment. And then it would go to Growth Committee for review to make sure that it aligns with the city's growth mandate and council priorities. Assuming that Growth Committee decides in the affirmative that yes, this is a project worth supporting, it can recommend support of up to $400,000 per project or more if Growth Committee recommends or council approves. And then assuming it passes muster, it then gets referred to council for deliberation by the entire body of council to review to again see if it abides by this policy, which again will be set by Common Council? And if so, then it empowers the city to act and make a withdrawal from that reserve for that specific purpose. And again, the idea here is to drive catalytic projects that would represent opportunities for the city to grow its tax base, its jobs, population, or to significantly enhance quality of life. I won't belabor the point anymore. The report is before you, but I'm happy to take any questions and joined by other staff as well.
Any questions for staff or any comments? My only comment would be, well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Dalbestein, and to Chair Killen for bringing this to our attention. I think the key for us in finance is, call it the matching principle. Money came from economic development. It's in a fund to make sure it goes to economic development through the lens and oversight of the Growth Committee, so it makes sense. Those would be all of my comments. I'd entertain a motion from the committee. Councillor Radwin, Councillor Hickey, moving the recommendation. All in the motion, all in favor, aye. Contrary minded, carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Item 4.1 is an orientation for Finance Committee, a review of many of our policies, and thank you, CFO Fudge.
Good evening, Chairman Sullivan, members of the Finance Committee. This presentation was tabled at our last committee meeting. We had a long council kit that evening, if you recall. So I do think it's important we take some time to revisit, I would like to call the foundation of our financial plan. If you paid attention to the Finance Committee over the last few years, you would have heard the word sustainability quite frequently. And our goal is no longer to be sustainable. That bar is now too low. The objective with city financing is to become best in class. And the word strategic is a buzzword you can hear in any organization. Simply said, the word strategic simply means identifying long-term goals and planning to achieve them. The concept applies to any function in an organization. It's no different for the financial management. However, to be successful in that planning, you need a strong foundation, and that foundation is governance. It is the set of policies, practices, procedures, and reporting protocols. It requires top-down commitment from council, which is essentially our board of directors, to executive management, who must embed it into the culture of the organization. If you don't have good governance, that foundation cracks, and you can find yourself very quickly spiraling in the wrong direction. So because governance is so critical to our financial success, this orientation is going to heavily focus on financial governance that has been embedded in our organization, and I'm going to try to demonstrate why it's important for us moving forward. So we'll start with a little bit of governance on the terms of reference. You're very well aware of this. The main features of the terms of reference for the Finance Committee is it's a 5-member Finance Committee, 1 member being the mayor, and to have quorum, there must be 3 members in attendance. Meetings are governed by the city's procedural bylaw, including Robert's Rule of Order. Common Council is the ultimate authority. The committee's role is to bring forward recommendations to Common Council for consideration in the form of committee resolutions. And the chair is the liaison between the Finance Committee and Common Council. Prior to 2016, the Finance Committee was primarily an audit committee, with very little role in setting the budget or involvement in the budget process. The governance of the Finance Committee was strengthened in 2016 when Common Council approved and expanded terms of reference for the Finance Committee, adding budget development, long-term planning, and continuous improvement to its mandate. And the Finance Committee has worked to strengthen the governance with the adoption of 10 financial policies you'll see on the slide, the most recently approved at the last Finance Committee meeting. These policies have been deemed so important to fiscal responsibility they have been included in the city's procedural bylaw, meaning for any of these policies to change, it requires 2/3 vote of Common Council. You have received orientation on the long-term financial plan, and you have heard each catchphrase, such as fix the roof before you buy new living room furniture. But I want to go beyond the catchphrases today. It's important for this committee to understand what's in these policies and how these policies protect the city from future financial downturns. So essentially, if you think about the past 5 years and the financial challenges that we've faced, I'd itemize them in I guess in this order. We've had a structural deficit. We had significant debt load. I apologize. We had an infrastructure deficit. We were very vulnerable to unforeseen risk with lack of flexibility, and we wanted to achieve commitment to financial excellence. And I'm going to show how each of these policies address each of these issues and why they're important. So let's start with the structural deficit. The structural deficit in 2018 to 2020, which you can see on the slide, you'll see 4.7 million, which is the gap between the red and the blue line in 2018. That structural deficit increased to 7.1 million and then 9.3 million in 2020. That was a result of having a chronic mismatch between the annual revenues the city raised and the annual operating expenses it was incurring. And so by virtue of needing a backstop, the city entered into a short-term funding agreement with the province to temporarily backstop that deficit for those years, which gave the city breathing room to find long-term solutions. This precipitated the need to undertake a major $10 million restructuring plan to eliminate this deficit to bring us back into balance in 2021. And a large part of that deficit was wages and benefits. You'll see on this slide, wages and benefits represent over 55% of the city's general operating budget. And you can see on the graph, if you look at 2014 to 2018, the wage increases for each employee group significantly exceeded property tax revenue growth. And if you look at 2014 as an extreme example, a year where the city saw negative tax base growth, you'll see that green line, which negative 0.48%. We actually experienced negative tax base growth in that year in 2014, but at the same time, we made wage increases in the range of 2.5 to 4%. So negative revenue, wage increases 2.5 to 4% when it's 55% of your budget. So, and we did that for many, many years. How do we balance our books? Well, we balanced the budget by increasing our debt, taking short-term tactics like reducing our capital from operating, reducing maintenance in our budget, all short-term unsustainable tactics to try to balance the budget and retain a tax rate. So the first policy that really helps this situation is the operating budget policy. We adopted that operating budget policy, and compliance with this policy is actually very critical to ensuring those structural deficits don't reoccur into the future. Some of the features in that policy which we've called don't spend more than you make, which sounds like common sense. City staff is not authorized to balance operating budgets with revenues that are short-term or not reoccurring. So if it's not a revenue we can anticipate or plan for, we're not allowed to use that in our annual operating budgets. We're not allowed to rely on one-time windfalls. One-time windfalls puts organizations in a hole the next year when that revenue is no longer there. The policy states the city should apply one-time revenues to one-time events such as servicing debt, infrastructure deficit, and reserve strategies. The policy also encourages the city to decrease its reliance on operating revenue outside of its control. Such is the case, for example, as the unconditional grant. In the past, it would be looked at as favorable if the city received a higher unconditional grant from the province, but in reality, that just made it more risky for the city of St. John because we had a much higher reliance on revenue that was outside our control. Case in point, in 2017, the city's unconditional grant suddenly reduced, really without much warning, from $20 million to $16 million in a single budget year. And we were left trying to figure out how we were going to fill the void of a $4 million revenue stream that was no longer there. Making matters worse, the city had no reserves and had very limited flexibility to shelter this unanticipated shock. Performance in the financial plan is measured by how much revenue the city generates on its own. It's also the reason municipal tax reform is so important for the city of St. John. The operating budget policy prescribes that the city cannot approve a budget that is not affordable as well. So if the city cannot bear the budget it costs without incurring either financial difficulty or risk of undesirable results to service levels, then we cannot approve the budget. It needs to be a sustainable budget. These are the details in the policy beyond the catchphrases. The policy calls for service areas to develop cost recovery policies that form the basis for setting user fees. For example, Mr. O'Reilly had brought forth user fee policy as it relates to setting recreational user fees. Those are all prescribed in the operating budget policy. Finally, the policy requires the city to only pursue government grants that are in line with its priorities set forth in our financial plans and our budgets. Government grants often require city funding obligations. They're never 100% funded. And when you chase those grants, you're susceptible to diverting from your short-term and long-term strategic priorities, and you end up incurring unforeseen costs that don't align with your strategic or financial goals. The second policy, which is instrumental to mitigating structural deficits, is the wage escalation policy. We refer to this policy as take control of your expenses before they can take control of you in the financial plan. Cannot stress enough the importance of this policy. The entire financial plan falls apart if we stray away from this policy, as these expenditures are approximately, as I mentioned, 55% of the budget. The policy ensures budgeted wage and benefit increases are affordable. They're linked to the city's tax base growth, based on a rolling 3-year average, but also sets a limit to wage escalation to CPI plus 1%, unless it's supported by a business case. This ensures a return on investment for taxpayers. This policy is good for taxpayers and for our employees. It mitigates the risk of tax rate increases. It mitigates the risk of reduction in service levels to the community. And it also mitigates the risk of future job losses for employees. And it's equitable in allowing the sharing of prosperity. As tax base grows, the taxpayers' benefit grows with better services, and there's an opportunity to share that with the employees at the same time. So that was structural deficit. That's how those policies will address that issue. The second major issue we had was significant debt load. You'll see the city's general fund debt back in 2008, if you look at this graph, was about $58.7 million. And then it quickly escalated to a peak of almost $120 million within a 5-year period. This is a significant debt load that has placed pressure on the operating budget and tax rate, with the city paying approximately $3.5 million every year just in interest payments on that debt. That $3.5 million in interest payment represents 5 cents on the tax rate. You can see with the long-term financial plan that debt is starting to reduce, and our target is to reduce debt by 25% by the end of the plan, which would be approximately $76 million in 2013. We're currently at 93.8, so we're making great progress on our debt. And that brings us to the debt management policy, and otherwise known as borrow wisely. This policy specifically stipulates that long-term debt shall not be used to fund operating or maintenance costs or used as a tool to balance the operating budgets. It also prevents the use of debt to buy assets with a useful life expectancy that is lower than the amortization period of the debt. So if we're going to borrow for 10 years, it doesn't make sense to borrow 10 years on an asset that's going to have a useful life of 5 years. And in that policy, the fundamental principle of the debt management policy is the city's capacity to issue debt. And that capacity should always be linked to the taxpayer's ability to service that debt. This is where strategy meets finance. Debt limits are set so we can meet our long-term affordability goals. So the policy calls for the tracking of 3 key performance indicators when it comes to debt. Debt per capita, which is each citizen's pro rata share of the city's debt. The debt service ratio, which is the percentage of the operating budget devoted to debt payments, and total debt outstanding as a percentage of the operating budget. For each of these key performance indicators, debt limits are set in our financial plan, set in the policy. You can read the limits in the policy, and the debt targets are set in the financial plan as well. The policy states that additional city debt is only permissible when existing debt is within the debt limit set forth in the debt management policy. We cannot rely on debt to fund infrastructure deficit in its entirety. It's too large. So a large part of the debt management policy and plan is to fund more capital from operating. And we brought our long-term financial plan update to the Finance Committee and to Council. And looking at our 2021 budget compared to the key performance indicators as set out in that plan, we're doing well. We're achieving every target that we set forth with respect to the debt management of the organization. Third issue, infrastructure deficit. So with lower revenue, lower growth, balancing the budget often came at the expense of investing in critical infrastructure renewal. In addition, the city did not have a complete inventory of its assets, nor did it understand the state of its overall infrastructure until the asset management policy and the asset management plan, for which R.V. Anderson prepared the State of the Infrastructure report. The most recent updated report indicates the city still is dealing with a $100 million infrastructure deficit on the general fund and a $300 million infrastructure deficit in St. John Water. And if you don't fund your infrastructure, they run risk of failure, which affects service delivery. So that brings us to the asset management policy, which is take good care of your property. This policy requires the city asset registry to include clearly defined levels of service and condition standards to allow the city to make evidence-based decisions when managing the city's assets. This information is compiled annually in a state of infrastructure report, as I mentioned. The policy really requires the city to evaluate the risk of asset failure and to consider climate change in our investment decisions. When making decisions to invest in new infrastructure, the policy requires a maintenance and life cycle analysis to understand the impacts of the decisions we're making in capital on the operating budget and our long-term financial targets. The policy improves transparency and accountability to the community when making these capital investment decisions. The capital budget policy also supports improving our infrastructure deficits. This policy was known as fix your roof before you buy new living room furniture. This policy sets required targets for capital renewal, prescribing that 85% of our capital budget must be renewal in existing assets, which deliberately targets our infrastructure deficit, and 15% can be assigned to new assets. These targets are sculpted to meet the city's long-term financial plan. The policy removes politics from investment decisions as it helps us prioritize capital investment with a matrix that places weighting on risk, safety, quality of life, regulatory requirements, and strategic alignment with Council's various strategic plans. It further focuses our priorities by allowing the city to pursue grants that often come with matching funding requirements for approved capital budgets or long-term capital plans and priorities. Finally, the policy limits the use of capital budget surplus to be used further to reduce debt or to be leveraged to reduce the infrastructure deficit. Whereas in the past, surplus funds were often used to support and justify other investments and other spends. Fourth issue that I had identified was being vulnerable to unforeseen risk and a lack of flexibility. The city was highly susceptible to financial risk with very little ability to fund unforeseen costs because there was little to no reserves in place. 2015 saw the city of St. John face a sudden $3.5 million deficit due to severe winter weather, for which there was no reserves to draw upon. The city also had very little flexibility to pivot to seize opportunities for growth opportunities and financial opportunities outside of the investments that were in the capital budget, which were primarily debt financed. So the reserve policy was implemented. Council approved the capital and operating reserve policy, for which we refer to as save your money for a rainy day. This policy is a cultural shift from spend and borrow first to save first. The reserve policy is a key risk management tool that allows the city to strategically meet its objectives to reduce debt, reduce the tax rate, address the infrastructure deficit, and be able to mitigate the risk of uncertain and unforeseen one-time future cost. It is also important to note transfers into reserves as well as transfers out of reserves require council resolution, adding another layer of governance and internal control to the process for accountability and transparency to the public. And how are we doing with our reserves? We currently have $7 million in operating reserves, $7 million in capital reserves. which are set aside to mitigate our risk to help us with unexpected events, unexpected infrastructure failures. We have COVID-19 reserves set aside based on our Safe Restart funding. We have reserves set aside for liabilities. Restructuring reserves have been established. Growth opportunities have been enabled, all due to the reserve policies that this council has put in place. We also implemented a budget monitoring policy. And the budget monitoring policy is also fundamental to achieving flexibility as it tightens budget controls in our budgeting process, which in turn will drive down cost. We refer to this policy as don't spend your grocery money on Netflix. This policy requires wages and benefits and goods and services to be managed separately. The policy does not allow service to use surpluses in wages and benefits to justify deficit spending in goods and services and vice versa. This will allow not only better line of sight on true budget variances that occur, but also allow us to assess whether any of these surpluses or deficits are permanent and merit permanent budget adjustment. Over time, what we hope to see is that these permanent adjustments as a result of tightening budget policy will result in surpluses that are able to be reapplied to the city's operating reserve funds, capital reserve funds, and to be applied to debt management. Finally, we talked about commitment to financial excellence. And the final policy that relates to this is the long-term financial plan policy that was approved. This is the governance policy. This institutionalizes and embeds financial governance into the culture of the organization. This policy will ensure fiscal responsibility remains a top priority for the city and councils of today and into the future. The policy stipulates that fiscal responsibility is a permanent council priority. It symbolizes council's commitment to financial sustainability, long-term strategic planning, adherence to the policies, and accountability, and responsibility to the taxpayer by requiring 2/3 vote of council to make any changes to the policies or the plan. The policy also permanently establishes a performance framework by which requires regular financial health scorecards and KPIs to be monitored, tracked, and reported to the public. And the policies that we implemented aren't policies we made up at the finance department. These are policies that are best practices. There's the GFOA, stands for the Government Finance Officers Association. They are a professional association of approximately 19,000 state, provincial, and local government finance officers. They recognize financial excellence. They draft and write best practice financial policies. And really everything we've implemented here at the City of St. John is modeled after those best practices. So all those policies, I know this is probably painful to go through this much detail, but it is important, really are the foundation for what you see here with the financial plan. So if we're to continue and to meet these established 10-year financial targets, if we want to have tax reduction plan that's $1.57 by 2030, if we want to reduce our debt by 25% by 2030, if we want to maintain our budgets to be structurally balanced, if we want to have flexibility, if we want to have sustainable wage and benefit envelopes, if we want to have assets in good condition that don't provide risk to the public of disruption of service delivery, if we want to have continued improved budget monitoring, if we want to have accountable agency boards and commissions, if we want to have transparency disclosure to the public, all these policies are incredibly important to ensure those continue to happen. And this quote kind of resonated with me. A budget is telling your money where to go instead of wondering where it went. And what we've done is we're telling our money where it's going. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions that the Finance Committee has.
Questions for CFO Fudge? Councillor Radwin.
Thank you, Chair Sullivan. Through you to Commissioner Fudge. I was just wondering, on your page 15, where it's the staff wages, 2019, you don't see any percentage there for fire and police. Why is that?
So fire is the red line. And I'm trying to look at a small, and the police is the blue line. So you'll see basically for fire, if you look at 2014, it was 4%. and then it dropped down to, I think, a little bit under 3%, I can't see the slide in front of me, but it's a little bit under 3%, and then 2.96, I guess it is, 2.96. So for fire, 4% in 2014, then from 2015 to 2019, which is the end of their agreement. That's why you don't see it extend beyond that. Same as police, both of those collective agreements ended in 2019, and negotiations have been ongoing.
I just wanted to say thank you to City Manager, Commissioner Fudge, and your team. You've done a lot of work in the last 3 years especially, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councillor Hickey, you're good? Just a few comments. CFO, I really do enjoy the fact that our staff has brought this to an English level. Certainly,
I failed at that.
you know, never apologize for bringing this information forward. People who sign up for the Finance Committee get quite excited about these kinds of discussions. But to help communicate why this is so important, one of the lines, I really like the budget monitoring policy, and maybe not just because it's one of our newer shiny policies and not quite as old as some of the others, but you know, the line that people used to talk about is you'd rob Peter to pay Paul. And it's probably the only expression you haven't used in the whole document, but it came to my mind just because we make sure that Peter looks after their area, and if there's an issue, we deal with that there. And Paul is over here and stays over here, and we make sure that we don't get mixed, because we need to make decisions based on true information. Very, very excited about that. And 2016-ish, you know, we talked about the word sustainable a lot, and I never liked the word, and I still don't like the word, because sustainable to me means surviving, right? And we are aiming for so much more. The work here in the financial plan, in my mind, is it's not about sustainability. It's about being the foundation that our city has so we can build and do things like we talked about last night at Market Square with the revamp of the whole public plaza down there. That can't happen if we didn't have our fiscal house in order to make sure that we could plan budget to allow that to happen. So those exciting things are happening because of the work that, you know, I'll give certainly credit to Chairman Merrithew, the past chair, who was very passionate about this. And one of the lines that our former mayor used to talk about was passing the baton on to the next council. And certainly Chair Merrithew and the work in our financial plan has been passed on to this council. And I appreciate the reminder, because it's really important. This council didn't live the $10 million structural deficit. So it's an important reminder of how foundational this work is, so that when we get excited about things like islands in front of Market Square and steps down to the sea, that happens and can happen, and we can talk about that stuff because of the foundational work that staff has done in previous councils. So thanks very much, and with that, I'll take a receive and file. Councillor Hickey, Councillor Redmond, all in favor, aye. Carried. .2, Kevin, would you like to introduce our draft capital and utility capital budgets?
Thank you, Chairman Sullivan. Before you this evening is the first proposed drafts of the 2022 General and Utility Fund capital budgets. Combined, these capital budgets represent over $43 million in community investment in infrastructure renewal and long-term assets that will contribute to providing valued services to the community. What is being asked here this evening is for the Finance Committee to provide feedback or ask questions to staff with a recommendation for a receive and file. This will provide the committee an opportunity to reflect, and we will bring the proposed 2022 capital budgets back before you at your next meeting with the ask that you then make a recommendation to Common Council for approval. Embedded in the general fund capital budget are the quality of life investments that you previously endorsed back in August. You'll see many of those investments in the document. I will also highlight this will be the only year you will see a single year view of the capital plan. Once council has approved council priorities and 10-year strategic plan, work will begin on creating a rolling 5-year capital plan along with the annual capital budget, which will promote long-term strategic thinking and allow the city to share capital priorities with other levels of government at a moment's notice when funding opportunities arise. I'm pleased to introduce this evening first Mr. Craig Levine. He's a senior finance manager in my office who's led the capital budget efforts for the general fund. He'll present the first half of the presentation. The second half of the presentation will be presented by the city's chief city engineer, Mike Baker, who will present the draft 2022 utility fund capital budget. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Levine.
Thank you, Mr. Fudge. Through you, Chairman Sullivan and members of the Finance Committee, I would like to provide you with a high-level overview of the 2022 draft general fund capital budget. This slide is an overview of the various inputs that go into the budget process. I won't go through each of these, but you can see the various plans, policies, and priorities that go into the budget. As per the capital budget policy that was actually updated a short time ago, the budget should consist of no more than 15% new investments and 85% renewal based on city share. The 2022 budget has 13% new investments and 80% renewal. The budget aligns with the financial principle listed here on this slide and helps achieve those goals. So overall, the draft budget is $29.3 million. City share is $12.6 million, with $8.3 expected to be borrowed and $4.3 coming from pay-as-you-go. And I just want to note that the borrowing amount and the pay-as-you-go amounts come from our long-term financial plan. And then we have other share at $16.6 million, with $3.5 coming from reserves and $3.1 million coming from funding from others. The city has been very successful leveraging funding opportunities. With city share at $12.6 million and matched with $13.1 in other funding, we're essentially doubling our investments. By having this leveraged funding, we're able to focus more on reducing our infrastructure deficit, climate change investments such as storm sewer separation, energy retrofit projects, and the district energy project, as well as focusing on our quality of life assets. This is just a snapshot of where the investments are being made as a percentage of the total budget. Now, I just want to provide a quick overview of the various service areas. I also really want to highlight that these investments mean more than just renewing our assets. Take road reconstruction projects in this budget as an example. On top of just renewing these assets, we're able to focus on mitigating climate change and environmental events. We are focusing on active transportation. We are able to look at more beautification and greening opportunities. And these investments also support growth in housing. Our current underground infrastructure cannot support development in certain areas of this city. And we are creating more safety measures for our citizens. We also have the opportunity through our fleet replacement to look at more greening options. Our investments of approximately $6.5 million in asphalt, sidewalk, and curb supports active transportation through the renewal of our sidewalks. We anticipate 4 to 5 lane kilometers of sidewalks to be rehabilitated. Ultimately, this will increase quality of life for residents and support active transportation. We are also proposing to start the design and investigation at the Honeysuckle Drainage Basin to mitigate future flooding events. The investments in facilities and asset management will be $5.19 million. These renewals will also help the city reduce our carbon footprint by lowering greenhouse gases. We are protecting our arts and culture with continued investments at the Art Center. We want to continue to invest in our recreation facilities with investments in Forest Hills Ball Fields and Clubhouse, Rocket Park Golf Course, TD Station, and the LBR. Our quality of life investments have been presented to both the Finance and Growth Committees, so I won't go through this list again as there have been no changes since the last presentation. But again, I just really want to highlight that these investments will support active transportation, beautification and greening our city, arts and culture, pedestrian safety, capitalizing on our waterfront, as well as significant investments in our parks, playgrounds, and fields. Lastly, some of our other proposed investments include renewal of our information technology, upgrading our 911 CAD system, upgrading and replacing records management systems at our fire and police, technology renewal for our parking garage facilities. Council has already approved $650,000 for new technology for transit. And lastly, there is proposed investment of $1.63 million for the city's transition to a new solid waste collection model. So in conclusion, the proposed capital budget aligns with city-approved financial policies, aligns with city-approved plans, and we continue to focus on leveraging funding opportunities, climate change mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, quality of life investments, asset renewal, and growth and development opportunities. And with that, we are recommending that the Finance Committee receive and file the 2022 draft general fund budget as presented, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Committee, any questions for staff? Councillor Redmond?
Thank you, Chair Sullivan. I have a couple of questions, actually. So I'm just wondering if we are to use the funds in the pay-as-you-go, the IT reserve, and the fleet reserve, if that leaves a balance in there.
Yes, it does.
It does. What kind of a balance, do you know, roughly?
I don't offhand. We can get you that information.
Yeah, sure. And I was just wondering about if there's been any consideration about improving the drainage in McAllister Place and Ross Avenue area. Seems to be, we seem to be flooded in those areas, and every time that we have a large rainfall, unfortunately.
Confer that to Commissioner McGovern.
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, maybe I'll take that one. There are several areas throughout the city where we need to be taking a look at potential flood mitigation. We need an overall strategy to do that, and we are looking at that. But for now, in this particular capital program, we do not see the ability to, or we have not sorted out the prioritized needs yet. To do flood mitigation across the city of St. John for all possible flood levels would be an undertaking of immense proportionality. So we do have to go through a bit of a prioritization effort and deal with issues as we can. And I'll ask Commissioner McGovern to add on to that, please.
Thank you. Good evening. Yes, just to add on to the city manager's point, in that area, there's a long-standing history of flooding-related issues. Some of the things that we are looking at tie back to the Climate Adaptation Action Plan, which is a longer-term measure, but actually replacing the gates at the causeway, which do allow some water back through there into the Marsh Creek drainage basin, and possibly also raising of that causeway at some point as well in the future. But it would come at quite a considerable expense, and it is a long-term item that we're looking at, and possibly also looking for funding associated with that, which would help in that whole drainage basin.
Yeah, I certainly know that, we're not going to have a non-flood zone in Glen Falls area, but I know that there's a lot of culverts that are really full of things, and the flood pool is full of debris as well. So just wanted to make that comment. I have another one, but I'll bring it up after.
Councillor Hickey?
Thank you, Chair. No, I was just, my only comment is that it looks good, certainly. As I think as we move forward, being rooted in this strict financial management, but also being able to make these key infrastructure investments, I think is showing the proof of, certainly this council, but the past council's resolution to be strict financial stewards. And I think we're seeing that pay off in the ability to make these pretty key infrastructure investments as we move forward. So it's exciting to see.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Radman, you had some more?
Yeah, I just had one other more positive question. In the plan proposed draft, it says that we'd possibly do 2.625 kilometers of sidewalk. I mean, I know it's probably not planned out what that would mean, but do we have any idea of roughly how many streets that would cover? I mean, of course, it depends on the area, I'm sure.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the member of committee, I'll refer that to Commissioner Hugenholtz.
Thank you, Your Worship. Most of those sidewalk repairs, they happen in conjunction with the road resurfacing. It's been our practice for probably 10 years or more that as we do road resurfacing, that we upgrade the adjacent curb and sidewalk, recognizing that it acts together as a system. So that's typically driven by the pavement condition index. So it's hard to say how many street sections, but it will represent a considerable improvement. When those projects happen, they really rejuvenate the entire look of the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's great. Thank
And
you.
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, one thing we did this year, which is probably a keeper for future years, to be determined, and it will be a decision of council in the moment, if our asphalt resurfacing program comes in under budget. As we did this past year, we could consider diverting some additional funds to sidewalk repairs. And when we do that, it need not necessarily be tied to full street reconstruction. It can be used for remediation of some sidewalks that aren't quite associated with a full street reconstruction yet. But that's more a management of capital funds in year. And of course, we come to council with those recommendations as is appropriate.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor? No, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Craig, I don't normally get specific on things, but I am going to ask you a specific one. Would this plan renew the funding to support the ice surface at Rainbow Park? I know our last capital budget did not.
There is no intent in the coming year to renew the surface at Rainbow Park, the ice surface at Rainbow Park. That was a sustainability initiative to shut down that ice surface for a 2-year period as part of the sustainability initiatives. So there's no plan to renew it at this point in time. And renewal of that ice surface is a fairly significant project because there are challenges both with the plant, but in addition to the operating costs associated with it. So no, and that's one of the reasons why there's a focus on the new space being developed in and around what's currently known as Loyalist Plaza, to consider putting an ice surface there as a all-season, or to enhance that space as an all-season space.
So then, is with that 2 years, is the intention to indefinitely suspend that ice surface, or?
Through the chair to the councillor, there's been no decisions made on that. The shutdown was for the 2-year period that we required under the sustainability initiatives, and we will need to return to council sometime next year to discuss the longer term purpose or future for that particular facility.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
So this is year 2.
This is year 2. Okay.
Very good discussion. I guess something I reminded of, well, first, actually, to talk about the fact that we were borrowing less than $9 million, but investing, well, overall, I think over 40 million when you bring the water investments into it, and we're borrowing less than 9. A few things go with that. One is our financial plan, the fact that we're following our financial plan. The other, and incredibly important, is other work that has gone on with the city, both with our elected officials and our staff, in work with our partners. So I would be remiss if I didn't thank our provincial and federal partners, because it is that whole team working together in a focused manner with the plan that is allowing us to move forward and do that. So for citizens who are watching, for borrowing less than $9 million, we are investing more than $43 million in your city. And the other piece that I am so looking forward to, and as we continue to improve, as CFO Fudge had mentioned, is a long-term capital plan. Certainly we have local concerns. Back in my day as a ward councillor, I remember taking a walk with Mr. O'Reilly along Millage Avenue talking about the sidewalks. And this is what happens when you speak with an engineer. He said, these sidewalks, they're obviously in poor shape. Yes, they're in poor shape, councillor. When do you think they can be repaired? He said 5 years. I said, 5 years? No, that's the plan, 5 years. And 5 years later, the street was getting torn up for renewal of the underground infrastructure for the division of the pipes underground. And sure enough, that's when I know the plans are there, because that's what engineers do. They plan and they're very good at it. So rolling that in along with the financial plans, I think it will be so important to help not only inform citizens, inform council, but help us make those longer term decisions. So I am so looking forward to that. Right now, it is a receive and file, councillors. Councillor Radwin, thank you, Councillor Hickey, for the second.
No action.
All in favor, aye. Contrary minded, carried. Yes. 4.2 is the draft general and utility capital budgets. Mr. Fudge.
Thank you, Chairman Sullivan. Mr. Mike Baker is here this evening. He's our chief city engineer. He's going to go through this presentation for us, and any questions that the committee has, I'm sure he'll be able to answer. Thank you.
Good evening. The proposed 2022 utility fund capital budget is aligned with the council's priorities, asset management plan, capital budget policy, the Central Peninsula Neighborhood Plan, and the budget prepares the utility to adapt for climate change. The 2022 utility capital budget was prepared with input from the senior leadership team, engineering, public works and transportation services, growth and community services, and strategic services to ensure that it supports growth. The total proposed 2022 capital utility fund budget is just over $14.1 million. The utility share of the funding is slightly under $6.5 million, with all of the funding coming from the operating budget. Of the $6.5 million, slightly over $1.3 million will be paid by industry, and just over $5.17 million would be coming from residential customers. To put this one other way, is 36.5% of the overall budget would be coming from residential customers, 9.4% of the overall budget would be coming from industry, and the remainder, 54.1%, coming from other levels of government. St. John Water has received or is seeking funding for over $7.6 million worth of funding for programs listed on the slide. Once again, this year the city will not be borrowing to fund the proposed 2022 utility capital budget. The draft utility capital budget focuses solely on asset renewal due to the utility's sizable infrastructure deficit. Through the COVID-19 Resilience Funding Program, it is proposed that St. John Water will be able to replace 8 roofs within St. John Water facilities at an 80% other share, 20% city share funding split. The utility will be investing in climate change through the reconstruction of the Beach Crescent lift station to allow it to be above flood levels and ensure reliable collection of wastewater, as well as investments to the Lancaster wastewater treatment facility to repair and raise the existing berms surrounding the facility in accordance with the council-approved climate change and adaptation plan. Many of the projects proposed in the draft 2022 utility capital budget are full street reconstructions and infrastructure renewals in accordance with approved funding programs. These projects will allow the utility to separate the old combined sewers into separate sanitary sewers and storm sewers, as well as renew aging water mains to better prepare the city for growth and development. All of these renewals would be completed while aligning with the general fund's proposed investments in beautification of neighborhoods, active transportation, and greening opportunities. This slide shows several other less significant projects within the draft 2022 utility capital budget. And with that, the recommendation is that Finance Committee will receive and file the 2022 draft utility fund budget as presented.
Questions from committee? Councillor Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Sullivan. Just wondering, there was a comment in the slide that there was some storm sewer areas that could allow more growth. Are there certain that would end up being looked after? Are there certain areas of the city where we couldn't have more growth because there wasn't sufficient infrastructure there?
Through Chairman Sullivan to the councillor, there would be some areas where the city would have to make some adjustments, potentially invest capital dollars in order to separate sewers in that area in order to allow growth.
What areas of the city would that be?
Well, it all depends on the storm sewer model. So when we have a development come in, we model that, and with that, we're able to adapt and try and make that development proceed by potentially doing smaller operational things to remove catch basins from a combined sewer system, or other things of that nature.
Maybe I could just jump in as well. The city has done an excellent job in recent years with separating combined sewers. We started out just less than 10 years ago with about 100 kilometers of combined sewers. We're now down to about 79, with plans to separate a further 7 to 8 kilometers as part of the bilateral funding in the Uptown Core. So there's a focus, as council's aware, Finance Committee is aware, with the funding we received in March of this year, where there's 79 Uptown city blocks that will be renewed as part of that infrastructure funding. And so as we progress through that, we will be focusing on other areas. But right now, there are no areas where we would say there's not the ability to develop. We figure out a way to ensure that it does happen.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, just to round out that story, we're getting pretty good at predicting where development might occur and then planning ahead to make sure that all of the underground utilities are there, not just stormwater separation. But there's also the possibility, and our capital budget policy caters to this, that if there's an in-year requirement, if all of a sudden a development opportunity presents itself and we think it's a viable development opportunity, there is the ability in-year to seek council's approval for an in-year adjustment to the capital policy, and what it requires is a sound business case. So I don't think we're at all in a position where we would ever turn away a realistic development. That's not at all the game we're in. Thank you.
Sorry, Councillor Hickey, just a quick follow-up. add on, I guess, to Councillor Redwin's question. A lot of the work that we are doing uptown right now, you know, and all the projects that are going, is a lot of that infrastructure work allowing that to happen?
Yes, you know, a number of the projects that are going on right now, like on Princess Street, are enabling some of that, as actually on both ends of Princess Street, enabling developments to progress. So we are always looking at developments, as our chief city engineer has said, modeling that, understanding the impacts, and then investing accordingly to ensure that the system functions as it should.
Thanks for that. Councillor Hickey?
Thank you, Chair. You somewhat stole my question there, so that's good. I think we're on the same page here. I guess, Brent, my question is, when we see the kind of development that we're seeing, in particular on the Central Peninsula, how do you manage that as it coalesces with dealing with 1800s infrastructure? How do you deal with that vintage, and how do we make sure we don't end up in a infrastructure crisis of sorts, whereby, you know, your development's gone too far, and yet we don't have the infrastructure, the in-ground infrastructure to support it.
Yeah, so that is really working hand in hand with growth team, and we sit down and, you know, look at where the hot spots are, where growth is planned, and also factor that into the investments we make. We're also undertaking a strategy in terms of separating storms. So as part of that undertaking, we'll also have input from growth into that to really look at, you know, where do we get the best investments, and, you know, over the coming years, to ensure that we're always staying a step ahead of the development.
And is that a reasonable concern to have? Like, is that actually a scenario that could present itself given the infrastructure on the Central Peninsula?
In terms of?
In terms of dealing with, you know, 1800s vintages and of infrastructure, like that question, is it actually a concern, or like, is it something we do need to manage in an effort to mitigate, or is it an unlikely scenario that we would end up in?
It is indeed something we need to manage. And so we do have, like, for example, a video inspection program where, you know, over a 10-year period, we do 65 kilometers a year. Over a 10-year period, we do the entire inventory. And there's a national classification system that our team kind of, you know, looks at and grades the sewers. And so when you look at our capital program here, it does lay out whether it's grade 4, 5, 3, 2, that sort of thing. And so that sort of input helps us address the infrastructure with the most challenges. And so we're always looking at what is in need of investment, and investing in that first. And then, you know, also putting the ones that are in better condition further down the road on the capital program, and adjusting that, you know, on a frequent basis, as the city manager has mentioned. You know, if a development comes forward, we're dynamic, we need to respond to that and pivot, and maybe come back to council with amended capital programs.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can I ask Commissioner Hamilton to speak a little bit about the checks and balances in the development approval process for managing utilities? Commissioner?
Yes, Chair Sullivan and members of the Finance Committee. I'd make a couple of points. First of all, at a high level, I certainly point out the fact that your municipal growth plan, Plan SJ, is very much grounded in focusing growth in areas where you have invested in municipal infrastructure. So our primary development area reflects the area where we have water and sewer in the ground, along with our intensification areas. So it's about ensuring that our capital budgets are optimizing that investment that has already been made. And then certainly with respect to development approvals, you as council have discretion and many of the planning approvals that come before you, and we certainly ensure that there is a full assessment of sanitary water, stormwater, sewer capacity as part of the infrastructure assessment, and we ensure that we're working hand in hand with the developer and ensuring that that the services are optimized to enable growth. So certainly I think we're well positioned. This council's made a lot of great investments to ensure that your growth areas are ready for growth, and that will continue moving forward.
Wonderful, thank you. Just if I can very quickly, Chair, I would just say on a bit of a separate note, it's great to see efforts like this and a more strategic, certainly a strategic focus on climate adaptation and efforts like that. But just on a separate note, it's great to see within this presentation and the past one, the conversations around livability in our communities. And I think that constant lens of how we're impacting neighborhoods and what we're going to do to better neighborhoods, even when we're talking about stormwater infrastructure and underground infrastructure. I think it's a really great lens to constantly use as we continue to build better neighborhoods, because I think it's certainly a huge priority of this council, but I think it speaks to the change in the dynamics as well around what livability means for us. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hickey, actually, and your comments just to me reminded me that, we no longer, this isn't a siloed organization, right? There is an opportunity to do work in an area. How can we as an organization improve that area? We may be digging a hole in the ground because it's pipes, but it's the opportunity to be there. How do we as an organization improve that area? I am so glad you brought that up. Great presentation. Again, back to $43 million of investment in the city on borrowing less than $8.4 million. It is such a wise investment and responsible stewardship of city's money. But I have to ask this question when you talk about pipes in the ground. We got any wooden pipes left?
Can probably speak to that. I think the last one was removed.
Well, we went from wood to clay.
We celebrated the last one, which was an intake that went out into Latimer Lake, and as part of the Safe Clean Drinking Water project, that was removed. So just approximately 3 or 4 years ago.
Very exciting.
We do have lots of terracotta.
Still lots of terracotta.
Yes.
So that's Lincoln's time. But, I'm just, again, excited that our conversations are strategic now. It's not emergency chasing things that are made of wood because we're leaking water into the ground. We are at a point where, yes, we have an infrastructure deficit. Yes, we are acting on it responsibly, but we are strategically putting this money, investing to support the whole city as an organization, to support growth, to support neighborhoods. As Councillor Hickey said, to look for opportunities to improve overall. So just very appreciative of staff's efforts. And again, it's the teamwork, it's the financial plan, working with the engineers, working with the departments, and certainly through the lens of council and finance committee. So just appreciative of all involved. And as exciting as it is, it's a receive and file. Councillor Hickey, thank you. Councillor Radwin. Any further questions? All in favor, aye. Contrary minded? Carried. Thanks very much, everyone. If there isn't anything else, I would take a motion to adjourn. Thanks very much. We're adjourned.